Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'll be painting this cute little bird in watercolor and using a very limited palette. I will be using just my Payne's Gray, which here it is, Payne's Gray, and then I'll also be using some burnt sienna, some yellow ochre, and then some Purell red. I think that I also end up using some sepia. I just didn't get the tube out because I didn't feel like I was going to run out of that color. I have my Fabriano watercolor block, 5 inches by 7 inches, nice and small. It kind of helps me just to feel a little bit less pressured when I'm painting on a small size, because then I kind of feel like it's just a sketch, even though I ended up taking this painting to completion. So I'm going to do a little sketch here. I'm actually sketching with a Prismacolor colored pencil, and I've been just kind of experimenting with this lately. I kind of like the idea of it. I know that one thing that I've struggled with is feeling like I have to draw really lightly so that my lines are hidden, and I've heard a lot of other watercolor artists just, talk about embracing having that line, and I've seen some other watercolor artists that I admire using just, really bold colored pencils and being very unapologetic about their lines, and I'm just kind of giving that a try, and so far I really like it. And I'm doing a pretty loose sketch here because, as I said, I kind of came into this with the mindset of just making this very sketchy and loose, and then as I progressed with it and liked it, I kind of took the painting really to completion. And I think that you'll probably see quite a few bird paintings from me coming up, so I hope that you're looking forward to that, because I am. I love birds. They are so fun to paint and so fun to watch too. The photo reference that I'm using, which you can see in the upper left-hand corner, is from pixabay.com. And if you're not aware of Pixabay, it is a photo reference website where photographers can upload their photographs. And these photographs are royalty-free and also copyright-free, and so you can use them for whatever purpose you need. So I like to use them for photo references for painting. Other people use them as stock photos for, whatever reason. And yeah, it's a really great website. I highly recommend it. There's also some other websites, but this is the one that I kind of just go to. I've found that even when I've checked out some of those other websites, I find the exact same photographs on all of them. So yeah, I'm really thankful for this. There are options to leave tips for the photographers, so I try to do that just to show, I think it's important to show that you appreciate that someone's putting something out there for you to use for free, and they kind of, it's nice that we live in a world where it's not always expected that, you have to make a transaction, but I think it's nice just to let people know that you appreciate what they do. And there are so many really great photographers on there. All right, so I am really going to be emphasizing the yellow in this bird even more than what I see in the photo reference. I thought that was really interesting because typically when I think about a robin, I think about, they have that kind of red-orange breast, and then I just always in my mind simplify what the rest of the robin looks like. I always think, it's kind of black or it's gray. And this one is definitely more brown, but I was really seeing a lot of nice warm undertones, so I really wanted to capture that. One of my favorite things about watercolor is that transparent quality that they have, and so I try to take advantage of that by looking for undertones in my subject, because I think that adds a lot of depth and dimension, so I really like to look for those opportunities and kind of exploit that. Doing a really simple background, just basically a wash of Payne's Gray. You can see little notes of yellow in the Payne's Gray because I didn't, thoroughly wash out my brush, which I really like when that happens actually, because then it just adds a little bit of color in there. It's very subtle, but then the background isn't so flat. And I'm gonna leave the little branches, the little evergreen branches, pretty loose in this painting. I'm just going to kind of capture the essence of the texture just by adding some directional strokes with various values. And I'm going to start out just using Payne's Gray for the entire background and the branches. And then a little bit later on, I'll glaze over some yellow. So now I'm looking a little bit more and finding areas that I want the yellow to be a little bit stronger. One thing that I think that I would have done differently is applied less yellow where the bird has more gray feathers, because I'll have to go in later in this painting with some white gouache just to kind of help gray out that area so that I get better markings. And now I'm using more saturated Payne's Gray to start blocking in some of the directional strokes for this branch here. So as always, you know, I'm being very intentional about not trying to copy every little bit of detail that I see in the photograph, and just trying to capture kind of the essence of the direction of all this texture. And I'm really just thinking of it as texture, because for me, if I start thinking about what it literally is, then I feel like I have to, you know, get every line in there and every detail. I'll leave a little bit of white just to kind of maybe give a very subtle impression of snow, but when I get done with this, I don't think it's like overt that there is snow. Although I don't mind that, and actually, even though I'm excited about spring coming and looking forward to everything that comes along with that, I know that I'm gonna miss winter, because I do kind of like winter. I have to admit right now I'm a little bit over it. So I'm okay with the weather getting nicer and the birds chirping and things like that. But I know that once it gets hot and humid here, I'm gonna miss it. I'm gonna be thinking about the snow and wishing there was a big blizzard happening right outside my house. And maybe I should try, when I'm having those days, maybe I should actually try to paint like a snowy scene. I usually try to paint whatever is actually in season at the time. I have this thing in my head where I always want to be kind of as authentic as I can, which is why you won't see me painting a lot of like big mountains and things like that, because it's just not where I live, and I don't even really go to the mountains very often because I'm terrified of driving on mountain roads. But, you know, sometimes, maybe. And I have that same issue though, even with like the weather. So when it's cold outside, I want to paint winter scenes because that's what I'm seeing every day, that's what I'm experiencing. And then in the summertime, I want to paint, you know, summer scenes. I don't want to paint winter scenes, but, you know, maybe when it's really hot this summer, I'm going to try to do a little bit of winter painting just so I can kind of pretend. So now I'm going over with a very light wash of the Purell Red to start building up the color in the breast area. But I'm keeping it very, very light right now so that I have a lot of room to add texture. And as always, I do want to just apologize in advance if you end up hearing my dogs snoring in the background like they're doing right now, or if you hear any weird chewing noises. I think they're both asleep now while I'm doing my voiceover, but every once in a while we get a big snore. And I'm using a new microphone. I'm still getting used to it. I've had a couple of issues with it, and I'm a little bit confused about it, to be quite honest. I think that overall the sound quality is better with the microphone, but every once in a while I hear like a weird staticky noise when I listen back. So I haven't quite figured out what's going on with that yet, so bear with me if you hear anything like that. And if you hear my dogs snoring. Alright, so now I am going into the bird with a little bit of Payne's Gray. Everything in here is still pretty damp. It's not completely wet. but I'm getting some nice soft edges here. Oh, and I think that I forgot to mention that I did add a little bit of my burnt sienna over some of the yellow just to kind of tone down the yellow. And now I want to add a little bit of texture, a little bit of shadow to the bird with this Payne's Gray. And now I am going to get ready to block in where the eye is going to be and also the beak. I'm only going to really add color to the bottom part of the beak for now, because there is a little bit of light hitting the top of the beak, and I haven't quite figured out at this point how I'm going to deal with that, because I don't want to add anything more to the background, but I also don't want to articulate a value that doesn't really exist in that beak. For the eye, I left it really blocky in general. I will just refine that as I go. And at this point, really everything is still very blocky in general. I really like the idea, and I've heard this talked about more in relation to sculpting, where you have this block and your job is to find the refined shape that is already inside there, and that's your sculpture. But I think that that really does apply to painting too. I think you start out very general and very loose and blocky, and as you go, that's when you begin to really discover all those little nuances that you already know are there. It's just a matter of getting to them. I like that mindset. I don't always work that way, but that is kind of how I was working today. I really wanted to keep this very loose, at least to begin with. And when I sat down to paint today, I really only planned to sit for maybe 20 minutes. It ended up being quite a bit longer than that, but that is okay, because sometimes I think it's also kind of like going to the gym. Sometimes I have to tell myself I'm gonna just show up at the gym and I'm gonna do like almost nothing. I'm just gonna, I like to swim, and so I say even if I just swim one lap, that's better than not swimming any laps. And I never just swim one lap. I always swim at least a couple, or sometimes a lot. And painting is the same. I have to say, you know what, I'm just gonna sit down and do a 10-minute sketch. And sometimes I do sit down and just do a 10-minute sketch, and that's awesome. And sometimes I sit down to do that 10-minute sketch and it ends up being 40 minutes. And that's all right too. I really needed just kind of a break today. Lately I have not had much time to paint during the week. I started going back to school, and I'm not even full-time at school, but I am just so not used to having homework, and my homework has just been taking up a lot more time than I really thought that it would. So I've been struggling to find time to paint with the job and just, life. It's always hard. And I just know from experience, because I've definitely had the experience where I went a really, really long time just being too busy and then also too mentally fatigued to really devote time to art, and it just wasn't a priority for a really long time. I don't want to fall back into that. So it's really important to me to keep at it, keep going, do just a little bit every single day, because ultimately, I have lots of goals in my life, but improving my artwork is a huge goal for me. It's extremely important. And I just know that those times where I felt like I couldn't make time for art, those were not great times. And so doing even just a little bit of art always makes me happy. Now I'm going over some of that Payne's Gray with some yellow ochre. Yellow ochre is not the most transparent watercolor. It actually has a bit of, I wouldn't call it opacity, it's not opaque, but it's kind of translucent. It has quite a bit of cover power. So I don't even know that I would necessarily call this a glaze in the sense that I typically use glazes, but it's definitely able to interact with that Payne's gray, and I wasn't really going for, you know, a green necessarily because I wanted this to be a very subtle and almost cool wintry scene. But I think that it adds a really nice touch, just a little hint of color, and then it also, I think, really helps to complement the yellow in the bird. And right now there's still a lot of yellow in the bird, but I'll be going over those feathers with some texture as we go. And now I am going to work on really bringing out some of the features, such as the beak and the eye. So I have Payne's gray mixed with sepia here. So it's a really nice, dark, rich neutral. And now I can start to kind of define the eye a little bit more. It was just kind of a dark stroke of paint before. And then also the little legs. I'm definitely painting the legs just a little bit darker than they really are in the photograph. And I don't think that I end up going over them with any kind of red or yellow, but I think that that's one thing that might have been good, just to add a little bit of color to the legs. But I don't know, I'm not sure that I would actually change that because I do like how everything is kind of subdued except for that really bright orangish red breast on the bird. Because even the yellow is going to get pretty covered up with Payne's gray and sepia and burnt sienna. One struggle that I was having was that even though I was using a lot of water in some of my mixes, I felt like the applications were a little bit too dark, especially when I was trying to add texture to the feathers, because I wanted to build those up very gradually. And so it seemed like a lot of times when I was applying these colors, they were going on a little bit too dark, which makes it difficult to create a very soft texture. So here I'm going to start doing a little bit more glazing on top of the yellow, mostly with Payne's gray, keeping it very diluted, lots of water, so that I can build up the texture very gradually. But I do want to leave yellow showing through. I definitely don't want to completely obliterate it. And as I mentioned earlier, I will have a little bit more yellow showing through in my painting than what you can really see in this photo reference. By the way, I know that I mentioned where I got this photo reference, but I'm also going to link it below in the description just in case you want to use it yourself. So feel free. I didn't make a template for this painting, but I think that I'm going to. So typically when I do that, I take my sketch that I do and scan that into my computer. So what I'll do here is I'll just kind of redraw that. It'll be loose and simple, but if you do want that, I'm gonna put that on my Gumroad page. Everything that I put on my Gumroad page is free, so feel free to download that. Hopefully I can get that linked below by the time this video is ready to upload. So if it's not there right away, it will be coming. And And I'm trying to figure out how I can really bring out the vibrancy in the breast area. So I decided that I'm going to glaze in some yellow into the breast area. And I also think that that will help add a little bit of cohesion throughout the entire bird, since it has so many warm undertones under the gray feathers. It makes sense to me that it would also have warm tones under the red orange feathers. So I put just a little bit of a yellow glaze there, and then I'm adding a little bit more yellow into the branches. Not too much though. I don't really want those to have any kind of bright colors. I want it to be, as I said, pretty subdued, pretty mellow and quiet and cool. But one thing that I do want to do with the background is probably just to add a little bit more depth in the value so that it doesn't look too flat or washed out. I'm going to go back into that breast area with a little bit more yellow. Actually, I think that this is a glaze of my Payne's Gray and my Purell Red right here. Yep. So that's what I'm using right here, just to add a little bit of texture into the more shadowed areas. And I also really like this combination with the Purell Red and the Payne's Gray because it's like kind of a nice muted violet, which I really like. And I think that that adds a really nice accent. Adding a lot more Purell Red to that mix right now, just to kind of brighten things up, especially in the areas that are getting a little bit more light. So I am just very lightly adding a bit of texture, just very short strokes that are just very quick and directional, just to add a little bit of texture and vibrancy there. And at this point, I have most of my colors in place, and so I'm beginning to build up more of the form in the bird, looking for areas that need a little bit more value or shadow or texture. And anytime that you see my hand leaving the screen, it's because I am wiping off some of the excess water from my brush onto a paper towel that isn't on screen, and using some dry brush technique to get more of that texture going. And now again doing a little bit more dry brush, this time with just pure red, just to add a final bit of vibrancy into the breast area. And so that has a lot of texture in it, and I'm just gonna let that dry brush red sit on top of that base layer. And I think that that adds so much in terms of dimension and vibrancy. And now I'm starting to add more value into the wing area. I'm definitely not going in there and painting every single striation that I see in the feathers, but I am trying to just kind of capture that general sense of individuality between the feathers without actually going and carefully painting each feather that I see. And then I also want to capture some of the value around the eye. I know that I need to do a little bit of work around the eye, and I'll end up using just a little bit of gouache to lighten up the area just directly around the eye a little bit. Just adding a little texture up here. And using a little red up there, even though I don't see a lot of red in the photo reference, I felt like adding a little bit of red notes onto those feathers on top would kind of be an interesting way to tie all of these colors together. And I'm realizing that down here, there's some areas that I really left too white, although You can see in my painting right now that the red-orange breast area is kind of butting right up against the yellowish gray top feathers. But in the photo reference, there is some gray kind of downy feathers in between that area. So that's where I'm going to end up using some gouache as well, just to kind of bring out some of those gray light little feathers. I thought about just kind of leaving it as is because I wasn't sure that I really wanted to use gouache. I actually, if you look over on my palette on the very far left side, I accidentally put a bunch of red into the spot where my white gouache is because it's white and I couldn't see it. I didn't even know it was there. So I was actually just looking for a place to put some red paint so I could dilute it a little bit, and ended up putting it in my gouache. So all I had to do, a little bit later, I will use my paper towel just to kind of clean that up a little bit so I can access that white gouache. Going back in and adding quite a bit of value into the branches with the Payne's Gray here, because I really want that not to be washed out and flat. I want it to have a little bit of dimension, but still keeping everything very loose, just using directional strokes again to kind of capture the essence of that area without going overboard. But I think it adds kind of a nice foundation, and I really like those loose brush strokes and that texture. I think it adds a nice contrast. Alright, so now I have a lot of these feathers in a good place. I like them. I think that the values are pretty good. But as I mentioned before, one thing I do want to do is kind of bring back some of those gray, soft, downy feathers that are in between the orangish red breast area and the grayish yellow feathers. So I'm just going to reactivate some of this gouache, and I will apply it in a way that it's pretty translucent. So I don't really want like an opaque coverage here, obviously, because I don't want any kind of stark white. When I first start applying this, it's going to look pretty white, but as it dries and fades, it actually creates a really nice blend effect with the colors that it's on top of. So I am using this really kind of in a dry brush way. It does have some water in the bristles, but I am basically not adding any more water to the mix so that I can control the direction of the strokes and keep them differentiated from some of the other colors that are underneath. So you can see already that this is adding a really nice texture. It's adding a really nice kind of blending soft effect that I really appreciate. And then too, I want to soften up the edges around the bird. I don't want it to look like it's, got, an outline or something like that. I want it to look very natural and soft. So I can use that gouache to just kind of soften the entire form of the bird. Of course, it's really important not to go overboard when you are working with gouache. So one last thing that I want to do here is to just add a little bit of lightness to the legs so that they don't just look like dark sticks. I want them to have a little bit of dimension and form. So I'm just going to add a little bit of translucent gouache on the legs and also on the beak. So this is kind of how I'm going to resolve the beak issue. Whereas before I wasn't really sure how to treat the top of the beak, but just adding a little stroke of gouache I think really helps. And then I'm also going to mix some of the gouache in with my yellow ochre so that I can just add a few spots onto the wing of the bird. Right now I'm just adding a few more overtones of that yellow ochre onto the breast just to brighten things up a little bit more. But I'm going to mix in some white with this gouache because there's just a few light yellow striations on the wing that I want to capture. So adding just a little bit of gouache to the yellow ochre will help me to achieve that. You can barely see that white gouache, I know, but it is there. And I don't want to use it, too much, and so I am letting it be pretty watery and translucent. But you can see here that it's adding a little bit of dimension just by mixing that in with the yellow ochre. And then I also want to help emphasize the eye with this as well. So I'm adding just a little bit of light coloration around the bottom of the eye because that helps the eye to look less flat. So now that I have everything in place, really, I really like that nice soft gray that I was able to add with the gouache. And I do just want to bring the eye out a little bit more by adding a little bit more of this light gouache right underneath the eye, a little bit just right on top of the beak where the light is hitting the beak. And then I'm going to add a few bold strokes of this gouache. It has a little bit of yellow in it that you can just barely perceive, but I'm going to add a few more opaque strokes right here just to give a little bit more dimension to this area. And that's really my whole thing about painting feathers and fur that I love so much, is because there's just so much definition, and I love trying to think about how I'm going to build that up. So that's why I'm always looking for undertones and looking for opportunities to do lots of glazes and layers and then add highlights on top. I just find that so satisfying, and I love getting wrapped up in that process. So here I'm just adding a few strokes of very soft gouache on top, and then I think that I will end up adding just a few little marks onto the wing with yellow and white gouache, just to add a little bit more interest right here. So I'm really emphasizing this area a little bit more than what the photograph is showing. And then adding a few strokes of a lighter yellow to the wing and to the tail. Again, just because I love building dimension and nuance. A little bit more gouache and yellow in here. I'm just about done. I'm just adding a few more layers here so that that really stands out. And this is basically done. So I really hope that you enjoyed this video. The template and the photo reference will be linked below. And if you're watching this video in March of 2020, I do have a giveaway going on for this month. So if you're interested in that, I'm giving away 2 complete oil painting sets. And if you're interested in entering for that giveaway, the details are in the description.